Hey guys, Navonod on No Limit Hold'em. Welcome to another exciting video on how to own every single player that you ever play for the rest of your life. I thought about calling this video a lot of different things, and in the Art of Stacking Bustas I liked a lot. Extreme Ownership Heads Up Edition, how to win every poker game that you play for the rest of your life no matter what, Heads Up, No Limit Hold'em, the Liberation of American Dollars or U.S. Currency, a love story. But I decided to name it all of those things. Now, what we're going to be talking about in this video, and maybe even this video series, is we're going to be getting back into some interesting things that I enjoy talking about. Instead of a forced and canned, even sometimes scripted, I know it's the worst, video series done for other people because they wanted, well, a real poker course for beginner intermediate players. Well, that's great. I'm happy to have been able to provide that. I hope everybody really enjoyed it. And I liked making parts of it, but I really just, I am ready to get away from that constricted, have to do series, video after video on the same topic. I get bored, guys, and the only way that I make money off of these things is to just get students, you know. So it's not like I'm getting paid hourly to do this, and I'm a pretty busy guy, so we're just going to get back to some things that I actually enjoy. This was also something recommended to, I've got this little strategy thread where a few of my more involved students and myself get on there and discuss hands, along with some of the other guys will pop in from time to time. And at least one of them recommended that we do that I do a video on exactly heads up play, and in particular GTO versus max exploitative or exploitative, and maybe even profiling and adjusting. So we're going to get into a lot of that. This may end up having to be 2 videos, but there is this game theory optimal approach to poker that some people try to take, and that's just to play a very balanced strategy, a very safe strategy where your opponents cannot exploit you, or at least to the degree that you pull off a GTO strategy, your opponents can't exploit you. And as long as they're not playing perfectly GTO against you in a heads-up game, you will have an edge, and your edge will actually be the degree to which your opponent fails to mirror your perfect strategy. That is just a true statement. If you're playing a perfect GTO strategy and your opponent is not, you're not going to lose in the long run, and your edge will be derived in a one-to-one, it'll be a linear function based on how far away they are from playing the perfectly balanced strategy that you are playing. But in the real world, and especially in small stakes and micro stakes, and this is really for players that play NL50 and below online, heads up, the max exploitative approach is going to be something like making binary adjustments against the leaks or imbalances you see in your opponent's strategy. So this is one end of the spectrum, or one pole, and this is another, but there's other things to do. I mean, this video series is gonna examine some of these ideas, like what should we actually be doing? Should we be trying to max exploit every leak that we find? Should we try to just be balanced and really focus on that and let the money just sort of come to us? Is there some middle ground? Is this even a question that can be answered within the confines of No Limit Hold'em strategy? Is it maybe more of a meta question? So this is the way that I try to teach my students to approach No Limit Hold'em strategy and heads up strategy in particular. We can call this Nav strat. I kind of like that. It's got a ring to it, right? I want players to get away from this idea that either GTO is the end-all be-all or that it's useless, and that your opponents make so many mistakes that why would you focus all this time and energy on learning how GTO ticks, or what makes it tick, or how it works, what it kind of looks like. Well, because you need to learn how poker works. And I don't know if there's another lens that you can see poker through, or a better lens that you can more clearly see the kind of inner workings of the game space of no limit hold'em strategy, that's going to be anywhere near as good as the lens of game theory. Game theory is a good lens to look at the game through. Also, if you have a pretty good understanding of game theory, then you can apply that in a lot of spots, and if you know how to develop ranges in a GTO type way, then you can have like a good default strategy, or not even default strategy necessarily, but a good like safe strategy for, you know, anytime like you're maybe losing to an opponent, or you can't find their imbalances, you can't seem to get an edge, and you're actually worried that you might be getting exploited. If you have this GTO kind of foundation to fall back on, then you can always retreat into the safety of the GTO fortress that you're hopefully building. So this is the way I look at it. Balance is needed, and exploit when possible. I mean, people have asked me about Nav theorem, and I've kind of made a bit of a joke about it. You know, like there's Beluga theorem and the fundamental theorem and the G-Bucks thing, the Galfond thing. What's the other one? Anyway, so we decided that I needed a theorem, and since then I've, I don't know, called like 6 dozen different things Nav theorem or Navonod theorem. But this is Navonod theorem 303, balance as needed, exploit when possible. You can play a GTO-based strategy. It's going to be okay. It'll do fine. The better you are at it, the more money you're likely to make against players that are really far away from GTO. You could just try to take every imbalance that your opponent has in their game and just exploit the hell out of them. You could enter the game with some kind of preconceived notions about how that metagame, that stake, that level, that player pool is going to play, and have like a little bit of a non-GTO or adjusted exploitable approach to the game. Or you could like try to play a balanced strategy until you yourself see this particular opponent that you're playing right here, right now, make some exploitable moves. And the question also, often comes up: should you, if you get a chance to, should you exploit the pants off of your opponent, or should you, just exploit them a little bit? Like if you've ever heard Doug Polk discuss his idea on how to play against heads-up villains, he seems to think that, and he advocates that, maybe you shouldn't exploit them to the degree that you really could, because you don't want to kind of tap on the glass. My words, not his. But if we're talking about a fish in the fishbowl, maybe you don't want to tap the glass. So if you can exploit them a lot, but not like completely exploit them, then like if they overfold, then maybe you don't have to bluff them every single time, so you can sort of store that fold equity up, maintain it, stop them from adjusting. Or if they're just super stationy and they're just way too sticky, then maybe you don't need to drop all of the bluffs out of your range, because again, you don't want them to adjust. Or the other, another way you can look at this, and this is kind of the way I look at it, is I just want to make binary adjustments against my opponents. Like if they're over folding, then I want to be over bluffing. If they're under folding, I want to be not bluffing. And I want to continue to beat up my opponents for whatever it is that they do wrong until they force me to change. So when they change gears, I'm going to change gears. And then we're going to get in this little dance that is what I call playing poker. And if you never make an adjustment against me, I'm just going to beat you. And if you do make an adjustment against me, my hope is that if I always apply this approach, then I'm going to get better at countering and countering the counters and adjusting and counter adjusting and countering that than what most people are going to get. And hopefully that's going to give me like a meta edge. So that's my personal feeling on it, but I don't think it's a thing that you can just answer true or false. So when we're talking about playing good poker and playing like a GTO based approach but still looking to exploit our opposition, what are we actually saying? What are we actually talking about? Well, we're talking about the way to win at No Limit Hold'em. And there really is only one way to win at No Limit Hold'em, and that is to make less mistakes than your opponents do. So how do you do that? Well, if you just play like a GTO balanced strategy, you're not going to make any mistakes, no range mistakes. Or, if you could play a perfect balanced strategy. So the closer you are able to actually play that perfect strategy, the fewer mistakes you're making. And so if you just then allow your opponent to make whatever number of mistakes they normally make, then you could make less mistakes almost by default that way, just because most players are bad at poker. But I think the real thing, the real deal, where it's really at, and especially in micro stakes and small stakes, and especially in like heads up, no limit hold'em, micro stakes or small stakes. I mean, the name of the game is to have a good, sharp default strategy that's not too far away from equilibrium, that wouldn't be too awful hard to go complete balanced with, but that is going to be a good place for you to launch your attacks against your opponent's imbalances from. So we need to have good, sharp default lines, good, sharp default ranges. We need to know what they are, but we also have to have good, sharp adjustments. We need to know if our opponent is doing this bad thing. How do we make them pay for that? How do we punish them for it? What does it look like? What does the counter to it look like? And then if we do put that counter into play, then how do we know when we are getting countered ourselves? Because remember that when you move away from the game theory optimal strategy into a more exploitative approach, to the degree that you are trying to exploit your opponent, you also open yourself up to being exploited by your opponent should they see what you're doing and then adjust to exploit your adjustments. So this is like the cat and mouse song and dance that I think is so much fun about specifically heads up no limit hold'em. So my approach and what I advocate, I kind of outlined here. I don't think it's that important. I mean, I think playing like the ace king queen game, where you're going to bet your aces. The ace king queen game is something I reference pretty often. It's a really good toy game for getting your head around game theory. It's like if we had a three card deck, just an ace, a king, and a queen, and we played this game called High Card Wins. We ante $1. We each get dealt one of these 3 cards at random face down, and then one of us either bets or checks, and we take turns being the player that gets the check or bet option. So if we ante $1 a piece, there's 2 of us, we're playing heads up. There's just one bet or check back, one option, one decision point where whoever's turn it is to be the guy who, like one player has a forced check option and the other person then can decide whether to bet or go straight to showdown. Well, the very best strategy you could do would be to bet all of your aces and to bet some of your queens and to never bet the kings. Exactly what you want to do. If you're playing against somebody who might be good at this, or you're not sure where he's at, and you just want to kind of play a game theory optimal strategy and just see how his mistakes present, what you can do, since there's going to be $2 in the pot, and let's just say that if you bet, you're going to bet $2. Say that's the rule. You have to bet $2 or check back. Well, you will bet $2 whenever you get the opportunity to, and you have an ace, hoping to get called by the king. and you are going to bet half of the time that you have a queen, because you're making a pot-sized bet. If you bet all of your aces and half your queens, then you're going to have 2 value hands for every 1 bluff, offering your opponent a price of 2 to 1, and that means that they're indifferent between calling and folding when they have the king. And that's what we're looking to do. With a game theory solution, what we're really solving for is how do we make both players indifferent? How do we reach an equilibrium where neither player has any reason to adjust their strategy? So the Ace King Queen game is the game that I try to play every decision point of every hand. You know, it's like I want to bet my strong value hands. I want to bet some bluffs, and I want to check the middle strength hands back and get them closer to showdown, maybe induce bluffs, and I want to be very polarized with my c-betting strategy. I want to be very polarized with my aggression in general, and I'm going to continue to do that from the very beginning of the first time I play against a given villain until he makes me change something, and then I'm going to adjust, and then we're playing that song and dance that's poker. You know, we're just looking at our relative hand value, like at every decision point. Do we have the ace, do we have the king, or do we have the queen? And if we frame our hand out by relative hand value, we can look at it like, do we have a nut value hand, a value hand, a showdown value bluff catcher type hand, or do we have a draw, or do we just have air? And then when we frame our hand out based on relative hand value, if we know something about our opponent, then we can adjust to include not just our relative hand value, but also our opponent's mistake propensities. Like if they call too often, then we want to stop bluffing. You know, if they fold too often, we want to bluff at every opportunity. If they're very aggressive, then we want to do less betting and raising and more checking back to induce bluffs with our bluff catchers. We don't want to bet thin for value and face a check raise. We don't mind checking back some number of traps to induce like big overbets on turns and bombing of rivers against us. We want to give them the opportunity to make the mistake that they like to make. That's kind of I would say that's the cornerstone, the foundation stone of my overall strategy is, you know, don't push if the donkey's going to pull. You know, I hear people say things like, you know, my opponent was 3-betting the hell out of me and I really didn't like it, and so I did this because I thought it would make him stop doing that. Well, that's dumb. You know, you don't want to. If your opponent's making mistakes, and if they're imbalanced, they sure as hell are making mistakes, the last thing on the planet you want to do is try to get them to stop making that mistake. As long as you know how to exploit the mistake that they're making. I should add that as a caveat, and probably a pretty damn important one. So the very first thing I'd say is, you need to understand how the incentives work in No Limit Hold'em. What incentive do you have to call the flop and fold the turn if your opponent has a c-bet percent that's, you know, pretty high, but his double barrel percent is 100%. So if you've got a player that's c-betting like, I don't know, 70% is pre-flop raiser, if he c-bets 70%, but of the times that he does c-bet, he double barrels 100% of the time, then you do not have any incentive to have any hands in your range that are going to call the continuation bet and fold to a turn bet. That would be bad. So the way to think of this is, if you know that your opponent has this leak where he doesn't check enough turn cards, or he just double barrels too often, specifically he fires the second shell way too often after he has fired the first shell, then one of the things you could do against that kind of opponent is just get out of the way, don't be there. And the other way to counter it is that once you do get there, don't fold. So maybe if the only piece of information you had about your opponent's mistake propensities was that he double barreled way too often, he c-betted a high percent, but he double barreled like every time, then you would take like the worst hands that you would normally call flop and then fold turn, and you would fold them on the flop. So the hands that are strong enough to call once but not twice, you just fold them because your opponent's not going to bet once and shut down. So why call on the flop and add that money to the pot and then let him win it on the turn? And then you would take the hands that are in the range of hands that you would normally call flop but just barely fold turn, like the best hands that you would usually call flop fold turn, and you just call flop and call turn with them. So that's how you need to look at these things. Like every feature of no limit hold'em strategy has like a Tao to it. It has like this yin side and this yang side. Your bluffs and your value bets go together. Your showdown value checkbacks and your checkback traps go together. And the the incentives align that way as well. This concept of quote goes with understanding that if your opponent does not bluff, like if your opponent never double barrel and triple barrel bluffs, if he never check raises the flop, bombs the turn, and jams the river as a bluff, then he does not have the right to stack you. You know, he's given you no incentive to call him down with anything that's like a non-nut value hand. And you need to think in those terms, and that's what this video or video series is really going to be all about. And it's a lot of what I do as a coach is I teach people how to think about these things. So we want to know what balanced play looks like through the lens of GTO, or game theory, I guess. So we can know what a leak looks like, and we can know how to retreat to our sort of GTO safety zone, home base. And we also want to know and understand game theory, so we understand the mechanics of no limit hold'em strategy, so that we know exactly how to exploit each type of opponent. So very basically, there's three mistakes that are there really are only three mistakes that a player can make, or three imbalances that a player can have. There are three main mistake propensities that a given player can have. And these can be different from one street to the next. Like some players are a little bit too tight pre-flop, but too loose post-flop. Something you'll see very often are players that are way too loose pre-flop, but that are kind of tight on the flop. So like probably the most common fish you'll see at the live casino games is this kind of fish who is way too loose and stationy and makes a lot of call mistakes. He's overly compliant pre-flop, and then on the flop he's overly tight. He just plays very fit or fold, but then if he calls the flop, he becomes a station and goes back to calling down too often. So how do we beat a player like that? Well, we might just have tight ranges with big raise sizes pre-flop to exploit his propensity to call too often pre-flop. But then the main thing I would say is, if you just exactly never c-bet the flop with the intention of giving up on the turn, you're going to really do a lot of damage to this guy. If you, I'm sorry, that's funny. If this guy is you, okay, scratch that. I said that backwards. Let's try that again. So, you have an opponent who calls too often pre-flop, and he plays very fit or fold on the flop. So if he hits, he calls. If he misses, he just folds. And he's missing like 2/3 of the time, and if you can make a half pot c-bet, then you can definitely bluff c-bet him. You can c-bet bluff and just print money against his misses. The thing that you actually don't want to do, and this will really beat him, is if your opponent is going to call very wide, he's too compliant pre-flop, he's going to call too often, he's not going to raise often enough for value, he's not going to bluff often enough pre-flop, then you have license to make big value raises. Let's say this is a heads-up game, and you have one of these kinds of players. You can go, instead of, if maybe you're usually min-raising at 75 bigs effective, maybe you could go like 2.5 or 3 times the big blind and just chop the bottom of your range out. Like, don't raise the standard like 75% that you're normally raising. Go to like 65% with a 3 times the big blind open, something like that. So tighten your range, increase your raise size to punish him for being a calling station pre-flop. Then, if he's going to play fit or fold on the flop, bluff the hell out of him. Bet often for value on the flop, and bet often for, because, he is going to just call or not call. So you can bet all of your value hands and all of your bluffs, and probably that's going to be, every single bluff is going to break even, or, every single bluff is going to make money in a vacuum if you can bet half the pot and get him to fold more than a third of the time. So if he's up to folding like 50, 60% of the time against your half pot c-bets, then you should never be like check folding there. C-bet your air on the flop. And if you know that once this opponent calls the flop, he never folds the turn, then never double barrel bluff him unless you know that he plays maybe overly tight on the river, in which case you can do one of two things. You can either just do a one and done stab, just stab flop with your bluffs, and if you get called, just shut down. And if you have a value hand, continue to bet. Or if you know that your opponent is going to exactly be a station pre-flop, he's going to play too tight on the flop, very fit or fold on the flop. He's going to overfold his range on the flop. He's not going to float you, he's not going to peel, he's not going to check raise you as a bluff with air on the flop. But you know that once he calls the flop, he's very sticky on turns. But then you also know that when you get to the river against this player, he overfolds the river. Then you can just make sure that your entire range is either stabbing the flop or triple barreling. So you just pick the best triple barrel candidates, which probably are going to be mostly draws, and you bet those on the flop. And then if they're backdoor draws and you improve, then you can double barrel with the intention of triple barreling, whether you hit or miss. And then you could like just stab your useless air once, planning to just give up if you get called on the flop, and then take your value hands for however many streets of value they're worth. Probably like 3 against a guy that anytime they call flop is gonna call turn. You can probably value bet most of your value betting flop, your flop value betting range, on turn and river on most runouts. But the way you want to beat this guy is you just don't want to have hands that exactly bet the flop, bet the turn, and then give up. That's suicide. You want all of your hands to bet the flop and give up, or triple barrel. And this is just how this stuff works. Your opponent's either going to be overly tight in a given spot, or they're going to be loose and sticky in a given spot, or they're going to be too aggressive in a given spot. And in any spot, they could be one way pre-flop, another way on the flop. They can be one way against double barrels and another way against triple barrels. These are all possible things. You really can't just look at your opponent and say, I think he's overly aggressive, and so I'm going to make sweeping adjustments on every single street, where I'm just going to bet and raise less often and check and call more often and really load up on my hero calls and my traps. It's not a bad starting point, but we got to move past that to get past the crawling into the walking and hopefully eventually running and flying stages. If your opponent's overly tight, don't give him action, sure. Bluff him often, sure. Don't value bet thinly. You can't value bet as thin as you'd like to against tight players, because you just end up wasting your hands. You end up just turning perfectly good showdown hands into bluffs. Or not even, they're not even bluffs, they just don't do anything good. Like when you have second pair with a mediocre kicker against a calling station, it's like a really thick value bet in heads up poker on most boards and runouts. But if you've got that same hand against a total nit, maybe if you bet, you never get called by worse, and you're probably still not going to fold out better. You're really just wasting your hand. So why not? try to take that hand to showdown. Or maybe if you under-rep your hand on the flop by checking, maybe your opponent will become more aggressive on the turn. Remember, like, these players aren't just going to be all the time, always tight no matter what. And some guys are, but you can't just assume that every player you play against you can just label as overly tight, overly aggressive, or overly compliant, and just stick with that on every street and every situation. And I think the perfect example is the example of the common casino $1, $2, or $2, $5 no limit hold'em fish. They call way too often pre-flop. They play fitter folds, they overfold on flops, and then if they call, so with their continuing range, they get sticky with again on turns and play more or less reasonably on rivers. And if you understand what incentivizes what and how to exploit each type of bad play, then you can tailor make and really like construct a perfect strategy for each opponent. Well, you can construct a perfect strategy to the degree that you understand your opponent's strategy. But just basically overly tight, don't give action. Like, that means don't call them when they're betting and raising, because they're not bluffing enough. That's why they're overly tight. You can bluff them very often, but you can't bet for thin value. Don't do that. And just typically you want to use polarized aggression. Like, use wide polarized ranges that are bluff heavy, generally speaking, against overly tight players. And against a player who calls too often, he checks too often, he's too compliant, he's going to take checkbacks and take calls and check calls, and he's not going to raise very often. You can value bet thin against him, don't bluff often against him, and you can probably use a lot of bet fold lines, but you don't want to be polarized against these guys. Against these guys, you want to be value heavy and linear. So you can just drop the bluffs out against them, and you'll bet like some, I don't know, second pair plus. So some cusp hand and everything better than that hand on every street where you think your opponent is going to have this mistake propensity. And if our opponent is overly aggressive, then we should be betting and raising less often against that player. We should check and call more often, so we should fold less often. And we really want to load up on our hero calls and our traps against that type of opponent. Well, that's going to do it for part one, guys. Thank you for watching. Shout out to some of the people that inspired me to make the series. Fede, Tim, this was really your idea, Tim, so shout out to Tim. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and are looking forward to the rest of the series. I finished this all in one long stretch. It's I think we've got an hour and 10 minutes to work with here, so we're probably going to chop it into 3 pieces. Till next time, guys. Navonod on No Limit Hold'em. Heads up. This is the OPP HU series. Yeah. Till next time. Good quote. LUCK. End quote.